Great, thank you, Dirk, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Marsh, and I'm here today to speak to you about First Nations knowledge and perspectives in the Yukon Sustainable Tourism Observatory. Thank you. Today, I wanted to help us develop the framework that you see in front of you. We had input from a wide variety of people, including Yukon residents, tourism businesses, municipal, territorial, and federal governments, tourism industry associations, community organizations, academics, and Yukon First Nations governments and organizations. Like all observatories, our framework includes the 11 mandatory issue areas, or key elements as we call them, but we also identified 6 additional key elements which are highlighted in green. For our region in Canada, these elements are all key to a balanced and accountable tourism sector. Today, I wanted to speak specifically about the importance of our First Nations partners in the Yukon. We lost the map. Thank you. There is evidence that First Nations people have existed in the Yukon for over 20,000 years. Today, approximately 25% of our population are First Nations people. There are 14 distinct First Nations that you can see outlined on the map in front of you. Each one has their own traditional territory, which cover most of our region. 11 of the First Nations that you see in front of you have signed modern treaties, also known as self-governing agreements, with the federal and territorial governments. These agreements enable the First Nations governments to make laws and decisions on their land and for their citizens. The agreements also require the government of Yukon, that I work for, to work closely with the First Nations to deliver programs and services and to manage land and resources. This means that they're a very important partner for all of us, and we need to continue to work together to measure and monitor the impacts of tourism through the Yukon Sustainable Tourism Framework. As you may have noticed, our framework included a key element called cultural sustainability. The goal is to ensure that tourism benefits Yukon's cultures, communities, and heritage. And the measurement themes within that key element include arts, culture, and heritage tourism experiences, Yukon First Nations tourism experiences and products, the degree of visitor participation in First Nations cultural experiences, visitor management, and to preserve and celebrate culture. But we know that this is not enough. We had significant involvement from First Nations partners in the development of our tourism strategy and in our framework. And we want to see First Nations knowledge and perspectives incorporated throughout the entire framework and used to inform policy decisions and program development. We plan to accomplish this through a variety of different ways. We want to be as inclusive and as specific as possible. For example, we conduct a census survey every 2 years that tells us how many businesses are owned and operated by First Nations people and organizations. We also track how many First Nations cultural festivals there are each year and how many people attend them. And we're working to improve our labor force survey so that we can track how many First Nations people are employed in the tourism sector. Specifically identifying First Nations people and organizations in our data collection lets us design and implement inclusive programs and services. We also want to include and incorporate data and information from our First Nations partners. This means that we plan to create data sharing agreements with First Nations governments, organizations, cultural centers, and businesses. The information they collect is valuable and is a direct reflection of their work and efforts. It is important for our framework to include that data and others from a wide variety of sources. We also want to understand and include traditional knowledge to inform our policies. Traditional knowledge is a term that we use that refers to information that is passed from generation to generation, or it can also include environmental observations, cultural insights, and beliefs. In the Yukon, our government is already using traditional knowledge in our work and programs and services. This means that we are making an effort to look beyond typical scientific evidence to learn from our First Nations partners about what they see, what they know, and what it means. For example, First Nation citizens in one community raised concerns about the number of people hiking on a particular mountain in the spring. They told us that there is a very important population of mountain sheep that use that area every spring to have their young, but the hikers are causing stress on the sheep, which was impacting the population. With these insights, the Yukon government and the First Nations governments worked together to close the trail in the spring to prevent disturbance to the sheep. Finally, we want to continue building and fostering relationships with our Yukon First Nations partners. We do this in our daily work, but we want to have regular meetings and check-ins with First Nations. With First Nations partners. We want to have regular check-ins and meetings with our First Nations knowledge keepers, citizens, elders, and experts specifically about the framework. We'd actually scheduled a workshop with our First Nations partners in the spring of 2020, but unfortunately the pandemic interrupted that session. Our vision is to learn from our partners about how they want to be a part of the framework, how they might use the data, and whether they have information or data that they want to share with us. We're also curious to learn more about who should be involved, what resources exist or don't exist yet, and what other considerations we should know about as we continue down this path. Now that we are able to meet face-to-face again, we're planning to host this session in the new year. We know that First Nations people have been living on the land for thousands of years, and their knowledge and perspectives are essential to the successful implementation of the Yukon Sustainable Tourism Framework. I really look forward to sharing more with you about this as our work progresses. Thank you very much for your time today.